So the vulnerable population we're going to be discussing today is domestic abuse. So what is domestic abuse? It's also known as intimate partner violence. So this includes physical, sexual, or emotional violence. This can include one partner belittling the other partner, controlling them, being overly jealous of other relationships, or when they're trying to go see someone, whether that be family or friends, they may bully them, tell them they're a bad parent. They may also try to control the finances, so not give them access to money. You can also use scare tactics. Another thing is they may threaten their children or threaten to hurt or kill their pets. They may also force them to have sex or use drugs or alcohol. And really, there is no specific background or way to see that someone is more prone to this than others. Really, it can happen to anyone from any background, religion, race. So the size of the population, so kind of looking at it locally here in Davis County, and then statewide, and then nationally and internationally, there's a pretty big difference. So here in Davis County, about 14.7% of the population has experienced domestic abuse. About 36.9% of Utah women and 19.6% of Utah men have experienced this in their lifetime. And then nationally, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men have experienced this. And then internationally, this was published by WHO. They said that about 35% of women worldwide have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. So kind of comparing the local to national, locally here in Davis County, it's about half, a little less than half of the international amount. But if you look at statewide, the statewide is a little bit higher than internationally. Another interesting statistic that I found was that about 42% of homicides are domestic abuse related, which shows how big of an issue it really is. So contributing factors or social determinants of health. There's a lot that go into this, and there's many more, but just a few that I thought really pertain to this was childhood experiences. So whether you were experienced to abuse previously, or gender, so transgender, female, male. There's more that are more prone to being victims, and those being perpetrators. So the environment maybe you were raised in, or the environment you live in now, whether it's more violent crimes, or maybe things that you've been taught, which leads us into education. So education plays a huge role into this, where people can actually address and notice that they are victims of domestic violence, and trying to find resources and help, and maybe not knowing that there is help through the state. So, like we had discussed before, this realistically, anyone can be a victim of domestic violence from any background, religion, race. It seems that women and children are more often victims. So some root causes. There was a really interesting study that was done here in Utah where they gave some papers out for survivors to kind of fill out so they could get more information on ways that they could help better the system and how they could help survivors. And the 4 things that they came up with that were most discussed was shortages of affordable housing, insufficient response from the legal system, access to mental health or substance use, and then unprepared religious leaders. And then another one that I thought really fit in was childcare. So going back to affordable housing, they discussed that this was one of the biggest barriers because there's a lack of affordable housing And it's also really hard to get property management to allow survivors to rent from them because usually it is stay-at-home moms with no history of employment, or if they had employment, it was a very long time ago, so they can't show financial stability. So this kind of leaves them at a really hard place where they can't really find a safe place for them and their children to live. Also, there's very limited space in shelters, specifically domestic violence service shelters. People are turned away. This leads to them having to go to homeless shelters, which also puts them and their safety at a higher risk. And then with law enforcement, there is a huge lack of education in identifying the aggressor and the victims and using certain language to not put blame on certain people. And there's also a huge issue with the victims facing domestic abuse charges because they were defending themselves, but they have a hard time proving that. And so it also affects their access to resources and child custody potentially. They also talked about increased access to mental health and substance use services. So helping those to kind of find ways to cope, healthy coping mechanisms instead of using drugs or turning to alcohol. And then also unprepared religious leaders, making sure that they are trained on these types of things because most are not. And so they just say religiously what they think people should do, which is pray and stay with the perpetrator because they don't want families to be broken up, which is usually not what should happen. Usually they should encourage them to leave because it's an unsafe situation. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So realistically, everything is unmet on all of those levels for someone that is experiencing domestic violence to the point where they need to leave. And then, so anticipated functional level is really, they're in survival mode. There's really not a whole lot that they can do until they get help and find resources. So specific concerns with communicable diseases. So you've got influenza, measles, hepatitis, those types of things. If you're living in a shelter in close quarters with other people, definitely a possibility. And then STIs, if you're experiencing sexual violence. And then non-communicable diseases, such as stress-related or heart disease, those types of things. And then self-care, self-harm, some things we've already talked about. So substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, suicidal behavior, depression. All of those can lead to even more issues if they are not addressed. And then, again, like we discussed before, so risk for harm by or to others. So the victim either facing physical abuse, so that can be bruises, broken bones, to the point of being murdered, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and then also protective orders, possibly not being taken seriously by law enforcement sometimes. And then here are the references.